The dense fog swallowed everything. 300 yards ahead, somewhere in that white void, a Japanese machine gun nest had already claimed 7 American lives that morning. The spotter beside Private First Class Raymond Collins lowered his binoculars in frustration. There was nothing to see, nothing but milk-thick clouds hugging the Bougainville jungle floor. Collins, however, wasn't looking. He was listening. His eyes were closed, his breathing was shallow, and then, almost imperceptibly, his finger began to move toward the trigger. What happened next would become one of the most debated moments of the Pacific Campaign. A single shot, a scream, and the machine gun fell silent. His spotter stared at him in disbelief. Collins hadn't seen a thing. He had shot at a sound, an echo, a technique so unconventional that his own commanding officers initially dismissed it as blind luck. But when Collins repeated the feat 17 more times over the following 6 weeks, luck became something else entirely. It became doctrine. This is the story of a man who turned his ears into weapons. A sniper who challenged everything the military knew about precision shooting, and a technique so strange, so counterintuitive, that trained marksmen laughed at it. Until they watched it work. If you find these untold stories from the Second World War fascinating, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing these forgotten heroes back into the light. Now, let us return to the jungles of the South Pacific. Raymond Collins grew up in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Born in 1921 to a family of coal miners, he never saw the inside of a proper school until he was 11 years old. His education came from the forest. His father, a part-time hunter who supplemented the family's meager income with rabbit and deer pelts, taught Raymond to shoot before he could properly read. By the time he was 14, Collins could drop a squirrel from 50 yards with a single .22 caliber round. But it wasn't his accuracy that made Collins different. Plenty of mountain boys could shoot. What set Raymond apart was his hearing. The Appalachian hollers, those narrow valleys carved between ancient mountains, created acoustic environments unlike anywhere else in America. Sound bounced off stone walls, echoes layered upon echoes. A single gunshot could reverberate for 10 seconds or more, each reflection carrying information about distance, direction, and the shape of the terrain. Collins learned to read these echoes the way other children learn to read books. He could close his eyes and tell you where a crow had taken flight based solely on the sound of its wings against the air. He could locate a stream by listening to the way water sounds changed as they bounced off different types of rock. And crucially for his later career, he could pinpoint the origin of a gunshot not by seeing the muzzle flash, but by analyzing the complex pattern of its echo. This skill seemed useless, a curious party trick at best, until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Collins enlisted in the United States Marine Corps 3 days after the attack. He was 20 years old. During basic training at Parris Island, his marksmanship scores were exceptional, but not record-breaking. He qualified as an expert rifleman with the M1 Garand, scoring 472 out of a possible 500. Good enough to earn a sharpshooter designation, but nothing that would mark him for specialized training. What caught the attention of his drill instructors was something else entirely. During a night training exercise, Collins had identified the position of an opposing squad based solely on the sounds they made moving through the brush. He had done this in complete darkness, with no visual reference whatsoever. When asked how he had accomplished this feat, Collins struggled to explain. It was simply something he had always been able to do. The Marine Corps in 1942 was not yet the institution that would later formalize its Scout Sniper program. Snipers existed, certainly, but they were often self-taught, selected informally from the ranks of those who demonstrated unusual aptitude. Collins was assigned to the 3rd Marine Division and shipped to the South Pacific in late 1942. He would not see significant combat until the following year. The Bougainville campaign began on November 1, 1943. The island, the largest in the Solomon chain, was strategically vital. Japanese air bases there threatened Allied supply lines across the entire Pacific theater. Taking Bougainville would neutralize that threat and provide a stepping stone toward the Philippines. The Marines landed at Cape Torokina on the southwestern coast. Initial resistance was light. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had expected the Americans to land closer to the main Japanese bases in the south. By the time he realized his error, the Marines had established a beachhead and begun construction of Henderson Field, the airstrip that would become the primary objective of the campaign. But if the landing was easy, what followed was anything but. The jungle of Bougainville was unlike anything the Marines had encountered before. Dense triple canopy rainforest blocked out the sun. Visibility dropped to mere yards. The humidity approached 100%. Rainfall measured in feet per month. And within this green hell, the Japanese had dug in. They employed tactics perfectly suited to the terrain. Small units, highly mobile, would infiltrate American positions at night. Snipers, concealed in the towering trees, picked off officers and radio operators with terrifying precision. Machine gun nests, hidden beneath layers of vegetation, would open fire without warning, then fall silent before the Americans could locate them. The fog made everything worse. Bougainville sits in one of the most meteorologically complex regions on Earth. Warm ocean currents meet volcanic mountains. Moisture-laden air rises rapidly, cools, and condenses into fog banks that can materialize in minutes. These fogs were not the gentle mists of European battlefields. They were walls of white, impenetrable, disorienting, deadly. For the Japanese, the fog was an ally. Their positions were already established. They knew the terrain. They could fire on known approach routes without needing to see their targets. For the Americans, the fog was a nightmare. Patrols vanished into the white and never returned. Mortar teams fired blind, hoping to hit something. And the snipers, the Japanese snipers hidden in their trees, continued their methodical work. Collins arrived on Bougainville in mid-November, assigned to a replacement draft for the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. His first taste of combat came 3 days later during a patrol through the swampy ground east of the perimeter. The fog that morning was absolute. The man walking point, a corporal from Ohio, was shot through the throat. The patrol scattered. Muzzle flash was invisible. The shooter's position was unknown. 2 more men were hit before the survivors could retreat. Collins, crouched behind a fallen log, did not move. He was listening. The shot had created an echo. The echo had bounced off something hard, probably a rock outcropping 40 degrees to the left of the perceived origin point. The primary sound wave had arrived first, followed by the reflection approximately half a second later. Based on the speed of sound and the delay, Collins calculated that the sniper was roughly 200 yards away, elevated perhaps 30 feet, positioned in a tree adjacent to the rock formation. He could see nothing, absolutely nothing, but he could hear the Japanese sniper shifting his weight, a slight creak of wood, the rustle of fabric, and then, just barely, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being worked. Collins raised his M1 Garand. He aimed at the sound, not where he thought the sniper was, where the sound told him the sniper was. He exhaled. He squeezed the trigger. The echo of his own shot rolled through the fog, and then, from somewhere ahead and above, came the distinctive thump of a body falling from height, followed by the crash of branches. Nobody saw it happen. The fog was too thick. But when the patrol cautiously advanced 30 minutes later, after the fog had begun to lift, they found the body. A Japanese Army sergeant, Arisaka rifle still clutched in his hands, a single bullet wound through his chest. Collins had made his first kill. He had done it without seeing his target. His platoon sergeant, a veteran of Guadalcanal named Thomas Hendricks, was skeptical. The shot had to have been luck. No one could hit a target they couldn't see. But Hendricks was also pragmatic. Whatever had happened, one Marine had killed one Japanese sniper, and that was a positive outcome in a campaign where such trades rarely favored the Americans. Word of Collins's strange shot spread through the battalion. Most dismissed it as exaggeration. A few expressed curiosity. One man, however, was deeply intrigued. Lieutenant Harold Weston was the battalion intelligence officer. Before the war, he had been a physics instructor at a small college in Pennsylvania. He understood acoustics. He understood how sound waves propagated through different media, and he understood immediately what Collins claimed to be doing. Weston sought out Collins during a lull in the fighting. He asked the young Marine to explain his technique. Collins, unused to such attention, struggled at first. He had never needed to articulate what he did. It was instinct. It was simply listening. But Weston was patient. Over several hours, he helped Collins translate intuition into method. The key, Collins explained, was understanding echo patterns. When a sound is produced, it radiates outward in all directions. When that sound wave encounters a hard surface, it reflects. The reflected wave travels back toward the listener. The time delay between the original sound and its echo reveals the distance to the reflecting surface. Multiple echoes from multiple surfaces create a three-dimensional acoustic map of the environment. The jungle, unlike the open fields where most snipers trained, was rich with reflecting surfaces, tree trunks, rock outcroppings, hard-packed ground, water. Each of these surfaces reflected sound differently. By analyzing the pattern of echoes, Collins could determine not only where a sound had originated, but also the shape of the surrounding terrain. This worked for identifying enemy positions. But shooting at those positions was another matter entirely. Here, Collins explained, the technique became more complex. He was not simply identifying where a sound came from, he was identifying where a sound would go. If he could hear an enemy's rifle shot and its subsequent echoes, he could reverse engineer the acoustic geometry to locate the shooter. But to hit that shooter, he needed to account for the same acoustic geometry in his own shot. In practical terms, this meant aiming not at the direct path to the target, but at the path that the echoes revealed. If an enemy was positioned behind a rock, and the echo pattern told Collins that the rock was 3 feet to the left of the direct line, he would adjust his aim accordingly. He was shooting at a target he could not see, using sound as his only guide. Weston was fascinated. He asked Collins if the technique could be taught. Collins was uncertain. He had developed this skill over a lifetime. The Appalachian Mountains had been his teacher. Could someone learn in weeks what he had absorbed over years? Weston proposed an experiment. He would select 3 Marines with demonstrated marksmanship ability and above-average hearing. Collins would attempt to train them. If even one could replicate his results, the technique might have broader applications. The training began in early December 1943. Weston chose his candidates carefully. Private First Class Daniel Morrison was a former musician whose ear for pitch was exceptional. Corporal William Thorne had grown up hunting in the forests of Oregon. Private James Yee, a first-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, had worked in his family's restaurant and claimed he could identify customers by the sound of their footsteps. Collins started with basics. He had the 3 men close their eyes and listen to the jungle. What did they hear? Birds, insects, rain dripping from leaves, water flowing in unseen streams, the rustle of wind through vegetation. He asked them to locate specific sounds: a coconut falling from a tree, a land crab moving through the underbrush, a distant explosion, origin unknown. At first the 3 candidates struggled. They could hear the sounds but could not pinpoint them with any precision. Collins instructed them to focus on echoes. Do not listen to the sound itself, he told them. Listen to what happens after the sound. The first sound tells you something happened. The echoes tell you where. This shift in perception was difficult. The human brain is wired to attend to primary stimuli and filter out reflections. We process direct sounds as information and dismiss echoes as noise. Collins was asking his students to reverse this priority. Slowly, over days and then weeks, progress emerged. Morrison, the musician, was first to demonstrate improvement. His trained ear could distinguish subtle differences in pitch and timing that the others initially missed. By the second week of training, he could locate a simulated enemy position within 10 degrees of the actual bearing, using sound alone. Thorne, the hunter, developed a different approach. Rather than focusing on individual echoes, he learned to perceive the overall acoustic texture of an environment. He would fire a shot and listen to how the jungle absorbed and reflected the sound. Each environment had a signature. Once he learned that signature, he could predict how sounds would behave within it. Yi struggled the most. His hearing was excellent, but the conceptual framework eluded him. He could hear the echoes, but translating them into spatial information proved challenging. Collins worked with him individually, using simpler exercises, gradually building the skill. By mid-December, all three showed demonstrable improvement. They could not yet match Collins's accuracy, but they could locate sounds to within a reasonable margin of error. The question remained whether this could translate to actual combat effectiveness. The answer came sooner than anyone expected. If this exploration of forgotten wartime innovation has captured your attention, consider leaving a like. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who appreciate real history over Hollywood fiction. On December 19, 1943, a Japanese counterattack nearly overran the American perimeter at Hill 700. The fighting was intense, hand to hand in places. Fog blanketed the battlefield throughout the night and into the following morning. Collins was attached to a defensive position on the eastern slope of the hill. With him was Morrison, the most advanced of his students. As dawn approached, the fog remained impenetrable. Japanese voices could be heard close, perhaps 50 yards out. Rifle shots cracked through the white. Men fell. Collins raised his Garand and listened. The Japanese were firing from multiple positions, 3, possibly 4 shooters. Their muzzle flashes were invisible, but their echoes painted a picture. The first shooter was directly ahead, perhaps 45 yards, ground level. The second was to the left, higher, probably in a tree. The third was farther back, maybe 70 yards, also elevated. Collins could not hear the fourth shooter clearly. Too much other noise. He aimed at the first, fired, listened. A grunt, a body falling, one down. He shifted to the second. This was more difficult. The elevation changed the acoustic geometry. He compensated, adjusted his aim slightly higher than the sound suggested, fired, listened. A crash of branches, 2 down. The third shooter had stopped firing. He had heard Collins' shots. He knew he was being hunted. Collins waited, seconds stretched into an eternity, and then, just barely, he heard it. The soft scrape of a boot against bark. The shooter was repositioning. Collins aimed at the sound. The target was moving. In complete visibility, this would be a challenging shot. Blind, it was nearly impossible. But Collins had spent his life tracking moving prey by sound. He led the target, anticipated its path, fired, silence. Then a distant thud, 3 down. Beside him, Morrison was firing as well. His accuracy was lower than Collins', but his shots were not random. He was hitting in the vicinity of enemy positions, suppressing their fire, creating opportunities for other defenders. When the fog finally lifted 2 hours later, the Japanese attack had been repulsed. Collins was credited with 7 confirmed kills during the engagement. Morrison was credited with 2. The technique worked. Word of the hill. 700 engagement reached higher command. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Smedley, the battalion commander, requested a personal briefing from Weston and Collins. What he heard intrigued him deeply. Smedley was a practical officer. He cared about results, not theories. If Collins and his men could engage the enemy in conditions that normally favored the Japanese, that was a tactical advantage worth exploiting. He authorized the expansion of Collins's training program and designated the group as a special sniper section attached directly to battalion headquarters. Over the following weeks, Collins trained an additional 8 Marines in his technique. Not all succeeded. Of the 8, only 4 developed sufficient proficiency to be operationally effective. The others were returned to their original units, unable to make the perceptual shift that the technique required. But those who succeeded became something new. They were not traditional snipers. They did not spend hours waiting for a clear shot at a visible target. They operated in the fog, in the darkness, in the chaos of close jungle fighting. They shot at sounds. They hit what they aimed at. The Japanese noticed. Japanese Army doctrine emphasized the sniper as a psychological weapon. A single well-placed marksman could paralyze an entire company, forcing soldiers to crawl rather than walk to fear every shadow. The Japanese had used this doctrine effectively throughout the Pacific campaign. But on Bougainville, something was changing. Their own snipers were dying, not in fair exchanges of fire, but in circumstances that defied explanation. Fog would roll in, the Japanese sniper would fire, confident in his invisibility, and then, impossibly, return fire would strike him with uncanny accuracy. Word spread through the Japanese ranks of American marksmen who could see through fog, who could shoot at sounds, who were, in the frightened whispers of soldiers, something more than human. This reputation, as much as the actual casualties Collins inflicted, had strategic value. Japanese snipers became hesitant. They delayed their shots, waiting for clearer visibility that might never come. Some refused to operate in fog at all, preferring to wait for direct sunlight. The psychological balance, for the first time in the campaign, had shifted. Collins himself remained remarkably humble about his achievements. In letters to his family, he barely mentioned combat at all. He wrote about the jungle birds, whose songs he found beautiful. He wrote about missing the mountains of Kentucky. He wrote about hoping the war would end soon so he could go home and hunt with his father again. He never mentioned that he had become one of the most effective snipers in the Pacific Theater. By late January 1944, the Bougainville perimeter was secure. The airfields were operational. The strategic objectives had been achieved. Fighting continued around the perimeter for months afterward, but the decisive phase of the campaign was over. Collins remained on the island until March, when he was rotated back to Guadalcanal for rest and refit. During his time on Bougainville, he had accumulated 31 confirmed kills. More remarkably, an estimated 2/3 of these had been achieved in conditions of severely limited visibility, including complete fog, heavy rain, and darkness. These numbers attracted attention at higher levels. The Marine Corps was in the process of formalizing its sniper doctrine. Collins's techniques, however unconventional, had proven effective. The question was whether they could be institutionalized. In April 1944, Collins was ordered to report to the Marine Corps training facility at Camp Pendleton, California. His assignment was to work with the nascent Scout Sniper program, sharing his methods with instructors and testing whether acoustic targeting could be incorporated into formal doctrine. The results were mixed. Collins discovered that his technique was extraordinarily difficult to teach. He had learned it organically over decades in an environment perfectly suited to developing acoustic awareness. Most Marines raised in cities or suburbs had never developed the foundational listening skills that Collins took for granted. Furthermore, the Appalachian Mountains where Collins had trained created unusually consistent echo patterns. The rock walls were relatively uniform. The vegetation was predictable. Bougainville, despite its challenges, shared some of these characteristics due to its volcanic terrain, but other environments, particularly the flat, muddy terrain of many Pacific islands, did not produce the clean echoes that Collins's method required. The Scout Sniper program ultimately incorporated some of Collins's ideas at a conceptual level. Snipers were taught to use sound as a secondary targeting indicator. They learned to analyze echo patterns for information about enemy positions. But full acoustic targeting, shooting blind at sounds, never became standard doctrine. It was simply too specialized, too dependent on individual talent that could not be reliably produced through training. Collins accepted this verdict without complaint. He had never expected his strange skill to become universal. He was content to have contributed what he could. The war, however, was not finished with Raymond Collins. In September 1944, Collins was assigned to the 1st Marine Division in preparation for the invasion of Peleliu. The island, a tiny speck in the Palau chain, was believed to be lightly defended. Intelligence suggested the campaign would last 4 days. It lasted over 2 months. Peleliu was a fortress. The Japanese had spent over a year fortifying the island's rugged terrain. Coral ridges were honeycombed with caves. Artillery positions were protected by 30 feet of solid rock. The landscape itself seemed designed to kill. And unlike Bougainville, Peleliu was not foggy. The sun beat down mercilessly. Temperatures exceeded 115 degrees. Visibility was excellent. Collins's signature technique was largely inapplicable. He adapted. Without fog, Collins fell back on conventional sniper methods. He was still an exceptional marksman, even if his most unusual skill was irrelevant. He operated in the ridges, hunting Japanese soldiers who emerged from their caves at night. He used the shadows of dusk and dawn, those brief windows when visibility was limited. And he developed new techniques specifically suited to the acoustic environment of coral caves. Sound behaved strangely in the Peleliu ridges. The coral created complex echo chambers. A voice spoken in one cave might emerge from an opening 200 yards away. Collins learned to exploit these acoustic tunnels. He would fire a shot into a cave entrance and listen. The echoes would tell him the cave's depth, its shape, and whether it was occupied. This information proved valuable for infantry assaults. Marines attacking cave positions could receive advance intelligence about what they would face inside. Collins could tell them whether a cave was deep or shallow, whether it had multiple chambers, whether defenders were present. This was not targeting in the direct sense, but it was reconnaissance of a type no one had attempted before. The Peleliu campaign ground on through October and into November. Collins survived, though many of his friends did not. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties on an island less than 6 miles long. When Collins finally left Peleliu in late November 1944, he had added 12 more confirmed kills to his record. His total now stood at 43. But more importantly to the Marine Corps, he had demonstrated that acoustic analysis had applications beyond fog shooting. His cave reconnaissance technique would be studied and refined for future operations. Collins did not participate in further combat operations. His enlistment was extended through the end of the war, but he was assigned to training duties stateside. He spent the final months of the conflict at Quantico, Virginia, working with the Marine Corps Equipment Board on experimental weapons and sensors. Among the projects Collins contributed to was an early acoustic gunshot detector. The concept was simple: microphones positioned in an array that could triangulate the origin of sounds. Collins provided practical input on what acoustic signatures were most useful for targeting purposes. The project was not completed before the war ended, but the research would eventually contribute to systems deployed decades later. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Collins was discharged in December of that year. He returned to Kentucky, to the same mountains where he had learned to listen. He married a woman named Sarah Hopkins in 1947. They had 3 children. Collins worked as a hunting guide and later as a consultant for the State Wildlife Service. He rarely spoke about the war. Those who knew him described a quiet man, thoughtful, patient. He could sit for hours without moving, watching the forest, listening. Children in the community learned that if they visited Mr. Collins, he might teach them to identify birds by their songs or predict weather by the sounds the wind made in the trees. He never taught anyone to shoot at echoes. That skill, he said, was not meant for peacetime. Collins' contribution to military doctrine was modest but measurable. His techniques were referenced in several post-war analyses of jungle combat. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper Manual, updated in 1969, included a section on acoustic indicators partly derived from Collins's wartime training materials, and researchers studying human auditory perception cited his case as evidence of the brain's remarkable ability to process spatial information from sound. But Collins himself faded into obscurity. He was not a famous sniper like Hathcock or Zaitsev. He was not the subject of books or films. His name appears in no popular histories of the Second World War. He was simply one of millions of young men who went to war, discovered something extraordinary within themselves, and then returned home to live quiet lives. He died in 1987 at the age of 66. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. He was buried in the cemetery where his parents and grandparents lay, overlooking the valley where he had learned to listen as a child. At his funeral, a small group of veterans gathered. Some had served with him on Bougainville. They were old men now, gray and weathered. They did not speak much. They did not need to. They simply stood together, remembering. One of them, a former corporal named Morrison, played taps on a battered trumpet. The notes echoed off the mountain walls, bounced from stone to stone, faded slowly into silence. The echoes, Collins might have said, told you everything you needed to know. What lessons does the story of Raymond Collins offer for today? The most obvious is that innovation in warfare often comes from unexpected sources. Collins was not a scientist. He was not an engineer. He was a poorly educated mountain boy who happened to possess a skill that no military planner had ever considered useful. His contribution to the war effort was entirely accidental. Had he not been on that particular patrol, in that particular fog, he might have served out his enlistment as an ordinary rifleman. His talent would have remained unknown. This suggests that military institutions should be alert to unconventional abilities within their ranks. The Marine Corps eventually recognized Collins's value, but only after he had demonstrated it dramatically in combat. A more systematic approach to identifying and developing unusual talents might yield similar benefits. The second lesson concerns the nature of expertise itself. Collins could do things that trained snipers could not. But his expertise was tacit. He could not fully explain how he did what he did. When asked to teach others, he struggled to articulate principles that he had never consciously learned. This is a common characteristic of high-level skill. Expert performers often cannot describe their methods because those methods are embedded in unconscious processes. Collins' acoustic sense was not a technique he applied. It was simply how he experienced the world. Transferring such expertise requires not just instruction, but transformation of perception itself. The third lesson is about the limits of institutionalization. Collins's training program produced results, but those results could not be reliably scaled. Only certain individuals with certain predispositions could learn what Collins taught. The military preference for standardized, repeatable methods could not accommodate such variability. Collins's technique remained a curiosity rather than a doctrine. This tension between individual brilliance and institutional replicability continues to shape military training today. Special operations forces, in particular, grapple with how to identify, develop, and employ exceptional performers whose abilities defy standardization. And finally, there is the human lesson. Collins was not defined by his killing skill. He was a man who loved the mountains, who married and raised children, who spent his later years teaching young people to appreciate the natural world. The war called forth something remarkable in him. But when the war ended, he put that something away. He chose peace. That choice deserves remembrance as much as his wartime exploits. The fog of war, it is often said, obscures truth. Commanders cannot know with certainty what their enemies are doing. Soldiers cannot see the broader shape of the battles they fight. Historians, looking back, struggle to separate fact from legend. Raymond Collins found a way to see through that fog, not with his eyes, but with his ears. He listened when others only looked. He heard what others dismissed as noise. And in that listening, he found targets invisible to everyone else. His story reminds us that the human capacity for adaptation is vast. We are not limited to the senses we were given. We can train ourselves to perceive in ways that seem almost supernatural. Collins was not supernatural. He was simply a man who had learned through long practice to use all of his faculties to their fullest extent. The echoes are still there, in every forest, every valley, every urban canyon. The world is constantly speaking if we only know how to listen. Collins knew. And in the jungles of Bougainville, in the fog that swallowed everything, that knowledge made all the difference. If this story has moved you, consider subscribing to the channel for more untold histories from the great conflicts of the 20th century. Leave a comment sharing what you found most surprising about Collins's techniques. And if you know someone who appreciates the hidden stories of military history, share this with them. Until next time, remember that history is not just about great battles and famous generals. Sometimes it is about a quiet man from Kentucky who could shoot at the echo.